Back in France, less than a week, Bonaparte saw that the time had come to act. Solemnly deliberating in the Luxembourg Palace, the Directory was about to be swept aside. The debt from 8 long years of war was mounting, draft evasion rampant. Bandits roamed the highways in the countryside. The government seemed powerless. Already there were schemes to overthrow it. As the crisis ripened, Bonaparte determined to find a way to seize power for himself. His moment, he knew, had arrived. He allied himself with one of the plotters, a member of the Directory, Emmanuel Sieyès, who needed the support of the popular young general.
This coup that Sieyès plans is a parliamentary coup, a political coup.
Dont Sieyès est le maître d'œuvre et où le sabre n'est en fait qu'un...
Sieyès is in charge, and force will only be used if something goes wrong. General Bonaparte is only supposed to have a supporting role in this coup.
On November 9th, 1799, Bonaparte and Sieyès set their plot in motion.
It's really a very simple premise, that the Parliament will put itself out of business. They will vote in a provisional government that will, in effect, start over again, draft a new constitution. They expect that the bayonets will never be unsheathed and a shot will never be fired.
For the coup to have an air of legitimacy, Bonaparte and Sieyès wanted the legislators to vote them into power. They didn't want to seize it. Bonaparte counted on the help of his brother Lucien, who had been elected president of the lower house of the legislature as a result of his brother's popularity. But Lucien was powerless to persuade the council to dissolve the government.
They run into real opposition. The opposition insists that every deputy renew his oath of allegiance to the existing constitution, which they do. It takes over 2 hours to do this. Meanwhile, the key plotters waiting outside in the wings, as it were, are getting very agitated, and particularly General Bonaparte, who eventually just loses patience and decides that he must intervene to speed things up. He enters the legislative house. This is strictly against the law. The legislature is barred to any outside military figure. And what he encounters there is genuine rage.
The members of the assembly, they see these bayonets and the bearskin hats marching down the main aisle with Bonaparte in between them. And they begin to shout and scream, outlaw him, he's trying to take over the government. And his brother, Lucien, said, wait a minute, my brother's not trying to take over the government, calm down. And they say, we want him outlawed.
Bonaparte never gets to utter a word to the deputies, and he is in effect hustled out by the grenadiers who had come in with him, and is quite badly shaken by this.
Bonaparte had bungled. The coup seemed lost. His chance for power finished. When some of his own soldiers began to doubt their general's intentions, his brother Lucien took control of the chaotic situation.
Lucien sees that Napoleon is going to miss the moment. He has the drums beat. He draws his sword. He walks over to Napoleon. He presses the point of the sword, Napoleon's chest, and he said, believe me, soldiers of France, if Napoleon aspired to take over the government, be dictator, I'd run him through.
The soldiers stormed the assembly hall. The cowed legislators fled, some jumping unceremoniously out the windows. At 2 o'clock that morning, a small rump of the council, in league with the plotters, reassembled and voted into law a new provisional government with 3 provisional consuls at its head. Bonaparte was one of them.
Ce triumvirat n'est en réalité
This triumvirate is only a facade.
Le coup d'État de parlementaire.
The parliamentary coup had become a military coup.
Et l'homme fort qui était
And the strongman is no longer Sieyès. Now it is Bonaparte.
Within weeks, Bonaparte outmaneuvered the other consuls, rewrote the Constitution, and made himself head of state under the title First Consul. As the year 1800 began, Napoleon Bonaparte, 30 years old, was the most powerful man in France. The revolution, Bonaparte said, is over. And then he added, I am the revolution. War had catapulted Bonaparte into power. Now, war would help him secure it. France was still fighting Great Britain and Austria. Bonaparte conceived a daring plan to catch the Austrians by surprise. In the spring of 1800, he took his soldiers over the Alps. 40,000 men, field artillery, trekking across treacherous layers of snow and ice through the great St. Bernard Pass. Not since the Carthaginian general Hannibal had an army attempted such an outlandish offensive.
It's 10,500 feet high. They dragged their guns in pine trees, they hauled it out like canoes, and they took off across the mountains.
On May 20th, Bonaparte made the crossing himself. Jacques-Louis David memorialized the adventure in his heroic portrait of Napoleon mounted on a gleaming stallion. In fact, Bonaparte crossed the Alps riding a sure-footed mule. It took the general and his army just 6 days. On the morning of June 14th, he faced the Austrians at Marengo, 45 miles from Milan. By the end of the day, there were 6,000 French casualties, but nearly twice as many Austrians had been killed or wounded. The French had won. My power depends on my glory, Bonaparte said, and my glory on my victories. Early the next year, the Emperor of Austria ordered a halt to the fighting and signed a treaty with France. Great Britain followed the year after. For the first time in 10 years, all of Europe was at peace.
Bonaparte had been in power just 6 months, and the people of France had seen other political regimes which had lasted only a year. They said, well, Bonaparte might not last either. After Marengo, things changed. Ordinary people, as well as people in the ruling class, now thought Bonaparte would last.
Now Bonaparte moved to consolidate his rule. At his urging, the French Constitution was again amended, and at 33, Bonaparte became first consul for life, with near dictatorial powers. A king in all but name.
The more power that Bonaparte gets, the more he wants. And it escalates step by step. Never too much at once, always step by step, gradually, and always with Napoleon looking back and saying, remember, I am going to protect the gains of the revolution. They're safe with me.
As the 19th century began, Bonaparte set out to prove that he could govern as well as he could fight. A newborn government, he told his secretary, must dazzle and astonish. He built new parks, bridges and quays along the Seine, canals, reservoirs, and roads. He would make Paris, he said, the loveliest city that ever was or ever could be. And France, the greatest country on earth. Launching a series of sweeping political, economic, and legal reforms, he laid the foundation for a new France. All of French society came under his gaze. He set in place a strong, centralized government with a tightly structured, far-reaching bureaucracy, organized a new system of state secondary schools, the lycée, established a central bank, the Bank of France. Slowly, the economy revived, and with it, prosperity. All of Europe was in awe. The great artists and thinkers of the day, Goethe, Hegel, Byron, Beethoven, saw in Bonaparte the embodiment of the ideals and hopes of the revolution. He oversaw the codification of a new system of laws, which abolished feudal privileges and established the equality of every man before the law. Bonaparte's civil code remains the basis of French law to this day. In 1801, Bonaparte signed an agreement with the Pope, the Concordat, making Catholicism the dominant but not exclusive religion of France. He had no personal use for religion, but he understood its political value. If I governed a nation of Jews, he said, I should restore the Temple of Solomon. Religion is excellent stuff for keeping common people quiet. Bonaparte ruled with the carrot and the stick. To reward men of accomplishment, he created a special mark of esteem, the Legion of Honor. My motto has always been, he said, a career open to all talents, without distinctions of birth. He believed in equality. A man should have the chance to rise on the basis of his ability, just as he had done. But he had no patience with those who demanded liberty. He ruled with an iron hand, crushing anyone who dared speak out against him, making a sham of parliament and free elections. I had been nourished by reflecting on liberty, Bonaparte said, but I thrust it aside when it obstructed my path. 34 years old, he was as powerful as any of the Bourbon kings who had come before him. All he lacked was a crown. Now, he decided he wanted one.
He wished to be a king. His idea is that given what France has achieved in the world, it ought to be considered as a kind of empire, with Napoleon Bonaparte as the emperor. This would put him on an equal footing with the monarchs of Europe. He would no longer be an upstart, he would be one of the club.
On December 2nd, 1804, the imperial procession made its way through Paris. A Senate proclamation and a vote of the people, both carefully arranged by Bonaparte himself, had given him what he wanted. He was about to become an emperor. As soon as a man becomes a king, he is set apart from all other men, Bonaparte said. I always felt that Alexander the Great's idea of pretending to be descended from a god was inspired by a sure instinct for real politics. In spite of the cold, 500,000 cheering spectators lined the streets. Bonaparte himself had meticulously planned every detail. The great cathedral, hung with pennants and tapestries and decorated like a Roman temple, seemed more like a theater than a church. But Bonaparte wanted his elevation to glow with the aura of religion. The Pope had been brought from Italy to sanctify the occasion.
Il a le coup de génie de faire venir à Notre-Dame.
He has the genius of making the Pope come to Paris, which gives everything a sacred air.
C'est Dieu qui indique que désormais
It is God who confirms that the changes that took place during the Revolution are forever established.
Slowly, Bonaparte and Josephine walked toward the two thrones that awaited them. His mantle, adorned with gold and precious jewels and weighing 80 pounds, was supported by his brothers. He looked, one spectator said, like a Caesar on a Roman coin. A little more than 10 years before, the French had beheaded a king. Now, they were crowning an emperor. Born upon the great tide of the French Revolution and the wars that followed in its wake, Bonaparte had turned his genius as a general and a statesman to the domination of France. Soon, he would turn toward the conquest of Europe. Already, he was planning an invasion of Great Britain to make him master of the island nation that dared defy him. Confidently, Bonaparte lifted the imperial crown. And brought it to rest on his own head. Then he moved toward Josephine and crowned her his empress. I am the instrument of Providence, Napoleon said. She will use me as long as I accomplish her designs. Then she will break me like a glass. Napoleon had inherited the struggle begun over 10 years before, when revolutionary France faced off against the monarchs of Europe who were determined to crush the revolution before it spread.
Napoleon inherited this extraordinary dynamism left over from the French Revolution. Everybody who had a crowned head, they thought, well, you know, what happened to Louis XVI might happen to him.
Napoleon represents the revolution and the expansion of the revolution. Not only the territorial expansion, but the expansion of revolutionary ideas. Napoleon goes into Europe with his bayonets, but also with the civil code.
Restless after long months of waiting, his soldiers were eager to fight. They were superbly disciplined, hardened veterans of the wars in Italy and the Rhineland. Napoleon called them La Grande Armée, the Great Army. They were the most feared men on the continent. They could begin marching well before dawn, and with little rest continue until nightfall. The emperor has discovered a new way of waging war, one soldier said. He makes use of our legs instead of our bayonets.
Imagine yourself carrying between 40 and 60 pounds of rations and musket and cartridges. Most of them were farmers' boys. Grown up used to misery and walking and working from day to night.
And these men would march something like 30 miles in a day. They'd march for 4 hours and stop, and then march another 3 or 4 hours and then stop again. And they would forage as they went. I mean, they don't have to worry about these big supply trains behind them.
The Grande Armée was an impressive sight. The splendid uniforms helped a soldier feel stronger, bigger, and braver than he was. Made him forget the brutal facts of warfare. They would fight for riches, the glory of France, and devotion to their emperor.
Once he said, "Who was the bravest man in this unit?" And the officer said, "This man." He took the Legion of Honor off his own coat and stuck it on the soldier's uniform. Can you imagine how that would spread in the army?
His soldiers idolized him, eager for just a few words of praise, or an even greater tribute, saved only for the bravest, an affectionate yank on the ear. He stood 5 feet 2 inches tall. With one hand thrust under his coat, he struck a pose common at the time and made it his own.
Avec sa petite redingote et son chapeau,
His little coat and hat were a kind of propaganda,
puisqu'il crée là un personnage
because he created a simple character,
austère,
austere but very recognizable.
He appealed to the privates by wearing clothes like that. Here is a man who dresses like we do, like the soldier does, not like the generals and the marshals, but like us.
Napoleon drove his men hard, but he drove no one harder than himself. He could ride for 10 hours at a stretch, often eating lunch on horseback. He slept in a tent or under the stars, lying down on his camp bed at 8 and rising after only a few hours' sleep, to spend the rest of the night studying reports and issuing orders. He still found time to write Josephine, reminding her of his love and showering her with kisses everywhere. Summer turned to fall. Napoleon's soldiers marched deeper and deeper into Europe. Waiting were 2 enemy armies that outnumbered them almost 2 to 1. The Russians and Austrians planned to defeat the French by sheer force of numbers.
The Russians and the Austrians thought that they would lick him. They were quite convinced that once they got him in the center of Europe, they would finish him off.
But Napoleon saw at once the flaw in the Allied strategy. Their forces were widely dispersed across the continent. By moving quickly, he could strike at the Austrians before the Russians arrived.
Well, he will swing in across Germany and cut off the leading Austrian forces. His plan is just hit first, hit with massed forces, and catch these boys before they can all link up.
In less than 6 weeks, the French reached the Danube, catching the Austrian army of General Karl Mack by surprise. While his enemy wavered, Napoleon struck the decisive blow.
He comes down behind him, and any sensible general would have run. But the Austrian general there, Mack, decided he'd make a fight for it. And so he held his position. Napoleon just whipped his army around him and isolated him and forced him into surrender just in a matter of days.
27,000 men surrendered. Mack had lost almost his entire army. "I did not intend to fight any but the English," Napoleon told the defeated Austrian general, "until your master came along and provoked me. All empires come to an end." Now, nothing stood between Napoleon and Vienna. "I have been rather overdone, my good Josephine. 8 days spent in soaking rain and with cold feet have told on me a little. But I have accomplished my object. I have destroyed the Austrian army by simply marching."
Napoleon, having moved at this great speed, 200,000 men marching 500 miles in 40 days. So there he has already, he's defeated half the Austrian army.
On November 14th, Napoleon led his soldiers into Vienna, capital of the ancient Austrian Empire. The Emperor Francis I had fled, leaving his palaces and gardens to the enemy. As Bonaparte triumphantly paraded through the winding streets, he portrayed himself as the representative of the French Revolution, a symbol of freedom and enlightenment. But many who had once worshipped him had by now changed their minds, including Ludwig Beethoven.
When Napoleon decided to make himself emperor, Beethoven denounced him as a vulgar person who lowered himself to the level of an ordinary king.
Beethoven had dedicated his Third Symphony to First Consul Bonaparte. Now he angrily blotted out his name. Emperor Napoleon, he said, is nothing more than an ordinary mortal. He would trample on all human rights and become a tyrant. 2 months before, Napoleon had been encamped on the English Channel. Now the Viennese elders were giving him the keys to their city. But his triumph had been shadowed by a disaster. On October 21st, the British Admiral Horatio Nelson had caught a French fleet at Trafalgar and utterly destroyed it, at the cost of his own life. Great Britain had lost its greatest sailor. But never again would the French challenge the might of the British Navy. Napoleon no longer had a fleet he could count on, and now in December 1805, the Grand Army itself was in danger. Although Napoleon had crippled the Austrian army and driven the emperor from Vienna, his conquest threatened to become his undoing.
It is winter, it is December, it is cold, he's surrounded by a hostile population. The Russians are coming to help the Austrians. His troops are dwindling in number and in supplies. He was almost 1,000 miles from Paris.
All of Europe had become a deadly trap. He was deep in the center of the continent. Prussia was now threatening to declare war. And on November 22nd, the Russian and Austrian armies finally united in a single fighting force, 90,000 allies against 75,000 Frenchmen.
You might say any sensible man would have stopped and perhaps done a deal with the Russians and the Austrians. He really had two choices, either to go back or go forward. Napoleon would never go back. So he thought, one more battle.
As November drew to a close, Napoleon roamed the countryside, studied the battles of Frederick the Great, pored over maps. Then he pointed to a spot not far from the little village of Austerlitz. It was a hilly field bounded by woods, marshy ponds, and small towns. Here he would make his stand. Looking it over, the emperor told his marshals, "Gentlemen, examine this ground carefully. It is going to be a battlefield. You will have a part to play upon it." 70,000 Russian soldiers would have a part to play too. Commanded by the Tsar himself, Alexander I. Just 28, he was eager, one of his aides said, to experience and win a battle, to cover himself with glory by defeating the invincible Corsican upstart. Vain, inexperienced, the young Tsar was an easy target for one of the greatest strategists who ever lived. Napoleon was outnumbered, but if he could control the battlefield, make the Tsar attack him when and where and how he wanted, he had a chance to carry the day. The battlefield at Austerlitz was dominated by a gently sloping hill, the Pratzen Heights. "If I wanted to stop the enemy," Napoleon said, "it is there that I should post myself. But that would lead only to an ordinary battle, and I want decisive success." Napoleon's army controlled the heights, but he would now sacrifice his commanding position in a daring gambit to lure the Russians to attack his right flank. With a thin line of soldiers on his right, he ordered his men to abandon the heights and watched as enemy forces occupied it. Napoleon knew his man. The Tsar called a council of war and argued for an immediate attack. The Russian general Mikhail Kutuzov objected. Blind in one eye from a battle wound, the hard-drinking veteran was contemptuous of his Austrian allies and wary of Napoleon.
Kutuzov tried to calm the Tsar's fervor. He sensed the trap. Perhaps he didn't understand the trap, but he felt it. He was an old fox.
The night before the battle, Napoleon dined on his favorite campaign dish, potatoes fried with onions. All across the French camp, his soldiers settled into their evening chores. He had already inspected the troops and sighted some of the cannon himself. He appeared a model of optimism and confidence. As he rode past his men, they shouted, "Long live the Emperor," and waved flaming torches. The camp blazed with light. It was December 2nd, 1805, the first anniversary of his coronation. Napoleon told an aide, "This is the finest evening of my life." Daybreak came with an impenetrable fog. The top of the Pratzen Heights floated like an island above the sea of mist. Napoleon's soldiers woke early and shook off hunger and fatigue. Each man preparing for a fight he knew might be his last.
The main killer is probably the artillery. You were just blown apart, ripped apart, or had a neat hole put through you. Coming in close, when it did get to bayonet fighting, why, it was usually pretty deadly, more killed than wounded. And there was then, of course, the infantry musket, the heavy lead slugs. Those really smashed and tore. Modern rifle bullet punches a neat hole, but these things just ripped, and they shatter bones and take out whole sections of the flesh. From
his command post on the Pratzen Heights, the Tsar, eager for battle, ordered the Allies down off the high ground toward the far end of Napoleon's weak right flank, anchored in the little village of Telnitz. Napoleon had a surprise waiting for them. 2 divisions of soldiers he had summoned from Vienna. They had covered the 70 miles in only 2 days. Napoleon had put reinforcements where they were least expected, and faster than anyone thought possible. His troops, exhausted after their long march from Vienna, struggled to hold on. So far, Napoleon said, his enemy was behaving like they were conducting maneuvers on his orders. Napoleon had wanted the enemy to attack his weak right. He now had enough troops to defend it, more than enough for his own plan: an attack on the Pratzen Heights, which was left with few defenders. Napoleon watched from his command post above the battlefield, waiting to spring his trap. Hidden in the haze at the bottom of the valley below the heights were 2 French divisions, 17,000 men. Napoleon gave the order to advance. One sharp blow, he said, and the war is over. The fog was so dense the French soldiers could barely see 10 paces in front of them. As the sun began to rise, Napoleon's army appeared out of the mist. On the top of the Pratzen, the Tsar watched the French materialize out of the valley. "They come out of a clear sky," he told an aide. "Your Majesty," his aide replied, "you should rather say they come from hell."
Alexander didn't know what to do. He was at an absolute loss. From that moment on, he completely lost control of his army. After the panic on the heights, he no longer participated in the battle.
Finding themselves attacked when they thought that they were the attackers, Napoleon said, they looked upon themselves as half defeated. By 9:30, the French controlled the Pratzen Heights, demolishing the center of the Allied position. Napoleon swept across the battlefield and attacked the Allies from behind. By 5 o'clock, Austerlitz was silent. "9,000 Frenchmen were killed or wounded, along with 16,000 Russians and Austrians." The Tsar and his army retreated. But the Austrian Emperor himself, Francis I, came to sue for peace from the little Corsican artillery lieutenant who had made himself an emperor only 1 year before. "A battle was fought today," Francis wrote his wife, "which did not turn out very well." Napoleon wrote Josephine, I have defeated the Russian and Austrian army commanded by the two emperors. I am a little tired. I embrace you. Austerlitz had raised Napoleon's star to new heights. He had won his greatest victory, the victory of which he would always be the proudest. Soldiers, he said, I am pleased with you. You have decorated your eagles with an immortal glory. You will be greeted with joy, and it will be enough for you to say, I was at the Battle of Austerlitz, for people to reply, there goes a brave man. In France, victory was cause for wild rejoicing. Peace seemed at last assured. In 1808, when Napoleon Bonaparte sent 118,000 soldiers across the Pyrenees into Spain, he imagined they would be welcomed. With my banner bearing the words liberty and emancipation from superstition, he said, I shall be regarded as the liberator of Spain.
Napoleon was convinced that the Spanish people would rise up in a revolution and that he would be acclaimed. He was completely mistaken about the Spanish mentality.
Napoleon could never imagine that some people loved their countries as much as he loved his own. It was a failing compounded by arrogance and pride that would bring about his downfall. Napoleon's economic blockade of Great Britain wasn't working. Defying his command, Spain had been trading with his enemy. Determined to bend the Spanish people to his will, he decided to make Spain a part of his empire.
L'Espagne, à cette époque, était dans un état d'avancement.
Spain at that time was far behind all the other countries in Europe.
Napoleon considérait un petit peu
Napoleon considered the Iberian Peninsula another world,
comme des gens des âges obscurs,
with people from the Dark Ages, dominated by clergy, according to Napoleon, who were illiterate, ignorant, and fanatical. He thought that there would be no resistance whatsoever.
On May 2nd, the Spanish people rose up against the French army in Madrid. By nightfall, 150 French soldiers were dead. The French retaliated. Killing thousands of Spaniards. It was the start of a brutal, no-holds-barred war, marked by savagery on both sides. The French tortured and mutilated their prisoners. The Spanish did the same.
It's a war of atrocities. It's guerrilla war. The word comes from this time. The French army has never fought this kind of war. Not at all the glorious war that they fought elsewhere.
At this point, you begin to see a failure of Napoleon's judgment. He had somehow lost sense of proportion. He gets into Spain, and he won't give up.
Thousands died, but there was no decisive victory. Napoleon would keep his armies in Spain for 5 years, unable to break the will of the Spanish people.
Napoleon n'accepte plus.
Napoleon no longer accepts advice.
Napoleon ne croit plus.
Napoleon only believes in himself. He only has confidence in his star.
Late hours, hardship, war are not for me at my age, he told an aide. I love my bed, my repose, more than anything. But I must finish my work. In 1811, there was still plenty to do. The bloody war in Spain continued. Britain remained a stubborn enemy, and now a new war threatened. Tsar Alexander refused to be part of the continental blockade of British goods any longer. Napoleon's edict barring trade with Great Britain was ruining the Russian economy. Tensions quickly escalated. Every attempt to negotiate failed. In the spring of 1812, ignoring the advice of his closest advisors, Napoleon invaded Russia. Never in living memory had so large an army been assembled. Italians, Poles, Germans, French. More than 600,000 men from every corner of his empire. Napoleon prophesied that the war would be over in 20 days.
An army of 600,000, it would seem to be absolutely irresistible, no matter what happened. He'll simply pour in enough men to overwhelm the Russians, force them to engage in battle, and defeat them.
Napoleon's army trudged slowly across Russia's immense spaces. He hoped to annihilate his enemy at once, but the Russians would not give battle. As the days passed, the blazing heat of the Russian summer began to take its toll. Soldiers fell out from exhaustion, sickness, and desertion. Thousands every day. After 2 months, before Napoleon had fought a single battle, 150,000 soldiers were out of action. At last, with summer ending, the Russians turned and faced their enemy at the crossroads village of Borodino. Moscow, the holy city of Russia, was at stake. The Battle of Borodino was a brutal slugfest. Napoleon threw his enormous army at the Russians in a frontal assault, showing little of his old strategic subtlety.
This was a wild attack. They were killing each other. There were deaths without stop. It was horrific. The battle began at 6:30 in the morning and lasted until 3 in the afternoon. At that point, both armies were exhausted.
The Russians fought the Emperor's armies to a standstill. The next day, they withdrew, leaving Napoleon proclaiming victory. Moscow was at his mercy, but the Russians refused to make peace. As Napoleon's army entered the city, he found it almost deserted. That night, Moscow began to burn. Mountains of red, rolling flames, Napoleon recalled later, like immense waves of the sea. Oh, it was the most grand, the most sublime, and the most terrifying sight the world ever beheld.
The Russians burned Moscow themselves. And when Moscow went up in flames, this was the worst blow to Napoleon's army.
И Наполеон не мог оставаться в Москве.
Napoleon couldn't stay in Moscow.
Fearing the approach of winter, but reluctant to abandon his conquest, Napoleon wrote the Tsar proposing negotiations. The Tsar responded with icy silence. After 5 weeks of waiting, Napoleon bitterly ordered his soldiers home. On October 19th, he led his men, laden with spoils, out of Moscow through the gate of Kaluga. It was a warm fall day. Three weeks later, it began to snow. The Russian winter had arrived early. Temperatures fell to 22 degrees below zero. Napoleon's soldiers froze in the open countryside. Our lips stuck together, one soldier wrote. Our nostrils froze. We seemed to be marching in a world of ice. Food ran out. Horses died by the thousands. Hungry soldiers quarreled over the horseflesh. They were fighting starvation, cold, fatigue, disease, and the Cossacks. The Cossacks harried Napoleon's flanks, tearing at his army as if it were a wounded animal.
The
army is being eaten away because it is being attacked on all sides. So the army fell apart, little by little. The French army no longer existed as a fighting force.
Napoleon watched as his army died. Fearing capture, he carried in a little black leather bag tied around his neck a vial of poison. 6 months before, he had crossed into Russia with more than 500,000 soldiers, confident of victory. Now, on December 5th, rumors of a coup in Paris forced him to abandon his troops and head back to the French capital. As his sled made its way across Europe, he told a companion, "It's just one step between the sublime and the ridiculous."
He lost 500,000 men, a staggering sum. Out of the 600,000 men who went in, 93,000 came back.
It was the beginning of the end, his former foreign minister Charles Talleyrand said. Smelling blood, Britain, Prussia, Russia, and Sweden united against him. Only Austria, ruled by his wife's father, wavered.